right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think we got about 2:15, so just in the interest of time. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name's Dan Fisher, and I'm going to be your Julie McCoy, if you will, over the next 45 minutes or hour here as we talk about driving change and making it stick. Before I dive in, I'll give you a little bit more of an introduction. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you in here are a manager or an owner of your staffing company? Okay, wow. So pretty much most, if not all of you. So, okay, great. So the reason why I ask is that the topic, the title, Driving Change and Making It Stick, which obviously we're going to talk about. And to give you a little bit more context, we're going to talk about what it means as a leader to be the catalyst for change and how to drive change within your organization. And I'm going to provide some more context around that. I'll give you a quick introduction on myself, though. So I've been in the staffing industry for 23, since 95. So whatever that is, I'm a salesperson, not a mathematician. 23, 24 years, something like that. So I grew up on the sales side, did sales, was a recruiter, ran a branch, ran a region of branches, about a $50 million budget, ran national sales, and I've also got some experience selling software. And so I've done just about every job that you can do in the industry outside of actually being an owner. What I do today, the quick shameless plug here before we get into the good stuff. So I have a sales enablement organization. So what does sales enablement mean? So if you think about anything that a salesperson or a recruiter needs in order to be successful to do their job, so not just training, but content, whether it be candidate or customer-facing content, coaching, having a well-defined buyer-line sales process, analytics. We provide, basically staffing companies come to us and outsource all of that to us. And so why I'm sharing that with you is it actually ties into what we're going to talk about today, because we've worked with about 450 different staffing companies across the country over the last about 10 years or so. And I've seen and learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work whenever you want to roll out a new idea, roll out a new CRM or an ATS system, or maybe a new strategy or a new message. So as we work through the presentation this afternoon, I'm going to try to share some stories with you with regards to, again, what I've seen that works and what doesn't work. And really what I'm hoping as the facilitator is to give you guys some actionable ideas to be able to walk out of here today that you can actually apply back in your office when you get back to your office next week. The only other house cleaning item, I guess, is, I prefer to keep this somewhat informal. So obviously I've got, things that I'm going to talk about and share with you. But if you have questions, don't feel like you have to wait to the end. Feel free to just raise your hand or just speak up and chime in. You can either do that from your seat. I think the ASA folks would prefer it if you could go to the microphone just to make sure that your question gets captured, because this is all being recorded so everybody can hear it. But on that note, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. And I want to start off by just kind of painting a picture. So let's pretend for a minute that all of us in here in the room, we've decided to start our own staffing business. And we're several years into our staffing business, and collectively as a group, we make up the leadership team. And let's also pretend, because we're allowed to do that, we are absolutely destroying the market. We're killing everybody. We are just light years ahead of everyone. Our revenue, our profit margins, every employee in the industry, they want to work for us. And so as a result of all that, we just have a mountain of cash to spend. And so as a leadership team, we've decided, hey, we're going to roll out some new training for our salespeople and our recruiters. And before we decide to do that, we come up with a strategy. And because we're the smartest people in the industry, right, we've obviously got the best strategy. But to make sure we have the best strategy, we even go out and we hire McKinsey and we hire Bain Company and all the best consulting firms, and they validate our strategy. And they say, oh my God, you guys have the best strategy. The next thing we do is we say, let's go hire the best instructional designers so we can build the best world-class content for our training program, because we want our recruiters and salespeople to be the best. So we go out and we do that. And those instructional designers create high-impact training. So best of breed, the latest and greatest of technologies and content and different exercises. So we're ready to rock and roll out training to our employees. And so the question becomes, does that guarantee that we're going to get the expected ROI? Does that guarantee that we're going to see the results that we expect to see, and we're going to see lasting results? And that's what I'm going to talk about as I kind of move forward. And by the way, I should have said this a little bit earlier, but as I talk this afternoon, I'm going to talk a lot about in the context of training, just because that's where my experience lies of rolling out training. But it's really important to know that when we talk about sustaining change, even if you get back to your office on Monday and you want to roll out a new idea, maybe you say, hey, I want you guys, this is how I want you to qualify a job order. This is how I want you to run a sales meeting. Or maybe you make a tweak to your ATS. Any one of those little things, something as simple as that, that's change. Everything I'm going to talk about today is going to apply to all those little things. And I'll try to work that in as I progress. But hopefully that makes sense. So we've got this world-class program ready to rock and roll. And so the question is, are we going to see lasting results? Well, here's kind of lesson number one that I've learned from doing a lot of training and working with a lot of staffing companies. What typically happens when an organization wants to launch a change initiative, again, whether that be training, the rollout of a new ATS, a new message, a new strategy, a new product or service, a new script, what happens is everybody gets really excited about the launch date. Yeah, training's going to launch on October 30th, and we have it on the calendar, and we build up a bunch of enthusiasm leading up to October 30th. And that's great. And then we go ahead and we launch the training. And then what happens, though, the big thing that we all tend to overlook is we underemphasize the sustain phase. And so what typically happens is a company will launch a change initiative. One of two things happens. One is they have a sustain plan in place, and they're able to roll out this project or this change initiative. They're successful, and they move on to the next initiative. What happens for 90% of companies, however, though, is they underemphasize the importance of the sustain phase. The change initiative quickly loses steam. They lose enthusiasm, and basically the initiative fails. So how many of you in here have a hard time getting people to use your ATS system the way that you'd like them to use it? Perfect example. So that ties, everything I'm talking about today ties right into that. It's a perfect example. So the question becomes, well, what is change management? And what is this you're talking about with sustain and sustain phase? So change management is the business practice of driving business results by asking people to change behaviors in their normal work routines. The challenge with that, though, is most people don't like change, right? Most people tend to resist it. Some people may say they love change, but when push comes to shove, they don't necessarily really want to do it, so actions speak more than words. And so as a result, they naturally resist. So if you want to start asking them to use your ATS system a little bit differently, or if you put them through recruiter training and now you want them to ask to maybe go about recruiting candidates a little bit differently than how they've done it in the past, people are going to naturally resist. So change management is the practice of preparing for and managing that resistance to minimize it. And so the practice of change management is designed to help you minimize your risk when you roll out change, such as training or an ATS, as two examples. And with change management, it's going to help you have improved decision-making within your organization. And the other thing is it's going to also prevent dips from employee productivity, prevent employee productivity from taking a dip in performance, right? So think about it. If you roll out a new ATS, if you convert from one system to the next, you're going to have to assume that there's going to be a little bit of dip or loss in employee productivity for that learning curve. Change management accounts for that by putting a plan in place up front. And so when we talk about change management, at a high level, there's three things that you need to prepare for. So the first is planning for the change. And so planning for the change, one of the key things that we find that organizations tend to overlook is what level of commitment are the leaders able and willing to make to support their people in change. So let me give you an example. Had a customer, this was going back several years ago, they reach out, they say, hey, Dan, we want sales training. We've been doing some research on your company. We want your training. It looks great. And I said, okay, that's great. So tell me, what are you looking for training on and who's going to go through it? And they said, well, we got 20 reps and we want to do this, that, and the other thing. And I said, great, okay. And how many managers are there? And they said, well, we got 2 managers. Okay. And so they're going to be part of the program, right? Because you didn't include them in the initial 20. Well, no. Our managers, they've been in the industry for 20 years. They don't need to do this. And so right there, I'm like, well, how, right therein lies the mistake. And so not only the manager's not going through the training and understanding what the salespeople are going to learn, but then to take it a step further, when you're preparing for change, you have to be thinking about and planning for what the managers are going to do to support adoption of the new skill or the new behavior, or if you're rolling out a new process. So to summarize that point, the managers have to be ready to change their normal work routine, and including the owners. And that's what I think in all 10, 11 years doing this, what we found, oftentimes managers say, well, gee, I don't really need to do this. I've been in the industry for 20 years. I know what selling is, or how to recruit, or how to roll out an ATS. So preparing for the change. The other thing with preparing for the change or planning for change. So if we're going to roll out, say, a new methodology on how our recruiters are going to go about conducting a candidate interview, before we roll out that new methodology, maybe the new questions we're going to ask or whatever it may be, we need to have an awareness of what degree of change we're asking of our recruiters. So is it just a small little tweak in how they're going about interviewing their candidates, or is it a 180-degree turn? And so you have to have an awareness of that, and then you've got to have a game plan of how you're gonna support them in that change. In a lot of ways, it's almost like preparing for a sales call. So if you do a good call plan for a sales call, you account for what objections you might hear and what your rebuttals are going to be. So as you're rolling out change, you got to think about, well, where are my people going to struggle? Where are they going to push back with this change? What's going to prevent them from wanting to adopt this? And so if you adopt that mindset, then you start to think about what your strategy is going to need to be. Second piece is implementing the change. So implementing the change, you got to have a plan to support and reinforce whatever you're rolling out as you're going through it. So from a training standpoint, what level of commitment are the managers able and willing to make to actively coach and support the people? To what degree are they going to be able and willing to model the desired behaviors? And how are we going to track and measure that? And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then the third piece is the sustain phase, which I touched on a minute ago, by far the most important piece, and I'm going to talk about that right now. So sustain phase, what I mean by that when I'm referring to that is sustain activities refer to all the activities that you want to do post-launch that's going to incorporate the change into your corporation's culture. So it's going to incorporate whatever it is you're rolling out into what you do and how you do it. So again, just using a training perspective, when you're enrolling people in training, whether it's sales training, recruiter training, whatever, it doesn't matter what kind of training it is, you're really enrolling them in a change management initiative because you're asking them to change behavior, and you need to think about what are the activities that we're going to do 30, 60, 90, 120, 180 days post-training to continue to reinforce it. Otherwise, you're going to have just another flavor of the month or a flavor of the day type training. And I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of organizations where I've had reps or recruiters come up to me and say, Dan, this stuff's great, but I don't know if our owners told you, but I mean, you're like the 8th trainer we've had in here in the last 10 years, And I'm, well, I appreciate you sharing that. That's good insight. And so keys to sustaining change is having these reinforcement activities, these sustain activities. So the question then becomes, well, what's the sustain activity? What does that entail? So let me give you a few examples. And again, I'm talking about it from a training perspective or within that context, but the same applies for any type of change you're rolling out to your organization. So from a training perspective, coach the coaches. So what that refers to is, and I'll just give you an example. So I'm working with a customer right now, several customers, but one customer in particular. So their sales team has gone through a very intense training program over a number of weeks with our organization. One of the sustain activities that we're doing is we actually have a call twice a month with the VP of sales and then his 3 regional directors. And what we're doing on that call is we're talking with the managers and getting their feedback so they share with us how they're going about sustaining the skills and the behaviors that were taught in the training. They're also sharing with us where they're struggling and where they feel like, hey, I'm not seeing my people adopt this or adopt that. And we're giving them ideas on what they can and should be doing to reinforce the training. So that's an example of coach the coaches. And I'm sure you guys all already know this. The key to rolling out any change, it really falls on the shoulders of the frontline manager. So the branch manager, the sales manager, the recruiting manager, because the recruiters and the salespeople working underneath them, they're gonna basically the questions that are being asked by the manager and how the manager is coaching and supporting them is going to really dictate how they act and how they go about executing their job. Again, I'm going to touch on that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. So that's coach the coaches. The second point says conversation ready. Anybody want to take a guess what I might mean by conversation ready? I know it's day 4. You're down $1,000. You're thinking how you're going to make your money back. And I'm asking you this ridiculous question. So go ahead.
Well, I would say that you would be able to speak to your team members and have a conversation about what the import of the change is, how they're going about it, but having a conversation to determine whether they're actually moving in the direction that you want them to move in. That's what I would think.
Yeah, so you're right. I'll add to that. So I think you're right, and I'll just make one more, comment. So I don't know if there's an industry that's more sales oriented than our industry. I mean, if you think about it, all we do is sell. You got recruiters selling to candidates, and you got salespeople selling to customers, and you got a back office doing invoicing and billing and payroll. Now, obviously, that's a simplification. There's other components. You get marketing in there and so forth. But my point is, it's all sell, 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 sell. And so in our organization, we use a term called conversation ready. And what that means to us is when a salesperson or a recruiter is on the phone with a candidate or a customer, and that customer or candidate asks them a question like, just send me the job description, or what's the job pay, or you need to talk to HR. My hands are tied. Either your rep or your recruiter is conversation ready, and they can navigate that conversation right then and there on the spot, and they keep the conversation moving down the path, or they don't, and the call ends, and now your sales cycle extends. And they're frustrated, and you're frustrated as a manager and owner because they're not getting in front of enough people, not getting enough meetings, not getting enough job orders. So one of the sustain activities that we do from a training perspective is we certify whether or not salespeople and recruiters are conversation ready. And the way that we do that is we video record them. So they'll go through training, and let's just say it's recruiter training, and we'll just, for a simple example, we'll have different use cases or scenarios set up where we know some of the common objections that a candidate will offer the first time they hear from a recruiter is just send the job description. What's the job pay? I don't work with recruiters. And we're looking for recruiters to respond a very specific way based on the methodology and how we train them. So we have them record a video, and we want to see if they can execute what's been taught. And so that's another way to sustain and reinforce the desired behaviors. So we have a whole sales enablement platform that we do it on, but we live in the day and age of YouTube. Everybody has a smartphone, so you don't have to use our platform or any platform. You can have your own people just record videos on their smartphone and review it with them, or do live role play. So that's a great way, and that allows you to physically see and hear whether or not they're adopting the skills or behaviors. You can take that same approach or same framework and apply it to just about anything. If you want to see if they know how to do a workflow in your ATS, you could you could actually create a scenario and ask them to go in there. How many of you guys use Zoom or GoToMeeting or any type of video conferencing? So you can give them homework assignments that say, hey, Dan, I want you to go into Bullhorn or whatever your tool is, and I want you to do a screen share, capture a screen share video, and I want you to see you add a candidate, send a candidate email out, do this, that, and the other thing, and then when the video's done recording, share it with me. And then that way you can prove and validate that they actually know how to do it. So that way there's no more excuses for why they're not documenting or whatever it is that you need them to do that they're not doing. So that's another sustained activity. On-demand coaching. So one of the other things that we do is, and this is a little bit unique, but you can use, how many of you have a learning management system, by the way? Anybody use a learning management system for training? So if you don't have one, there's a million of them out there. You might want to think about getting one. They're relative, they're pretty inexpensive as far as, you can put all your training content on there. So what we do with ours, in that scenario where a rep or a recruiter creates a video of themselves practicing, validating whether they're conversation ready, is after they do that, a notification will go off to the manager. And the email will say, hey, Dan, John has completed his mission of objection handling. Send me the job description. So then the manager, without having to take the time out of his or her incredibly busy day, can just go and look at the video, watch it, provide feedback right in the system, and then give it. And then there's an email notification that goes back to the employee. So it's another quick way. It's an easy way. It lightens the load of the manager because you create all the scenarios up front. And the criteria up front, and then that way they're providing on-demand coaching. So it makes it a little bit less taxing for the manager, but it continues to reinforce the skill or the behavior we're trying to drive. Quarterly leadership workshops. So the customer I was referring to a few minutes ago, where we have a call twice a month with the managers. The other thing that we do a quarterly workshop with them where we get together. So we'll do training online, but then we get together in a workshop setting and actually practice what was taught in the training. Again, so you can do the same thing if it's with your ATS or your CRM or anything else. Get everybody together, do a half day, do a full day, whatever it takes. The point is, you don't want your people to think that whatever this change that you rolled out was just, again, sort of flavor of the month or flavor of the day that you got excited about. You've got to have a plan to sustain and reinforce it ongoing. Some of the other things that we've done that are kind of fun, we'll do role play battles. So again, we're a training company, so just kind of going back to what we do from a training perspective. So we'll actually have the sales team, we'll get on the call. We'll create a scenario. Somebody will play the role of the client or the candidate, and then we'll have each recruiter go and role play the same scenario with somebody playing the role of the candidate or the client. And we come up with a scorecard, where we quantify how we're gonna judge them on certain skills or behaviors that we want them to exemplify. What do you think happens when peers have to get on a video conference call and get in a role play competition with each other? What do you think happens? How do you think people respond to that? Oh, they freak out. They're like, this sucks. I know it sucks. That's why we're doing it. Because if you can do this and role play in front of your peers and your boss on the phone, your sales calls and your recruiting, your candidate calls are going to be a heck of a lot easier. So again, it depends on what the change is that you're rolling out. So you got to think. There's just different scenarios that you can apply just based on whether you're rolling. Maybe you're opening up a new market or whatever it may be. And then the other thing that we'll do is like a recertification program. So another customer that went through training with us beginning of the year, actually we do this with all of our customers, beginning of the year, and then when we get towards the end of the year, we'll do a recertification program where they have to take a quiz, and then we'll have them do certain role play scenarios, not everything, but just a few things to make sure that they're still actually applying it. And we literally give them a pass-fail. And then if they fail, they got to do it over. And the great thing about it is, at least the way we do it, everybody gets to see each other. So we want all the sales reps to see each other's videos of each other. Recruiters get to see everybody's videos of each other. And the reason why we do that is not to try to embarrass anybody. Social learning. It allows everybody to learn from one another as well. So if you've got somebody down in your Dallas office and they're a master with your ATS and they know all the shortcuts, and they're able to capture a video, think about it. You got somebody else in your Chicago office and they're really clunky with your ATS or whatever it may be. Now they can start learning from people and the best practices that they're using in another office. And again, you can do this all from your telephone, just recording it, or again, Zoom or GoToMeeting or what have you. So those are just a couple of examples of sustain activities. Now, there's one challenge with sustain activities. So sustain activities, who do you think owns and drives and manages the sustain activities within the organization? So if you're rolling out change, who's going to take responsibility for this stuff? Yep. Who specifically within the org chart? Top down, exactly. So the problem herein lies is most managers struggle with finding the time to do this stuff. In fairness, managers are busy, whether you're an owner or, on the executive leadership team or a frontline manager. And so frontline, all levels of management just struggle to find the time to be able to commit to doing this, and they just look at it as extra work. But here's the thing, and it is extra work. There's no question about it. But here's the thing, and kind of, I guess, maybe almost like the challenge I would just put out for all of you is if you're going to roll out change, if it's worth, doing, if you don't take the time to do this, your organization is going to be in the same place it was 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road. So it may be taking time up front, but the point is it's going to save you a lot of time in the future. This week is a perfect example. I imagine all of you have all kinds of great ideas you've picked up over the last 4 days. And so what you should be thinking about as you get on your flight back home tonight or tomorrow or what have you, and you're thinking about implementing these ideas, what you need to start thinking about is reverse engineering it. So whatever it is you want to implement, start with the end in mind. Start with what's the vision? What's successful change look like, and what am I going to need to do to get my team there? Yeah, great. Yeah, depending on what you're rolling out. So excellent point. One of the things I learned, I didn't know this when I got promoted into management, and I'd be working with a rep or a recruiter and as a manager, and if you've been in the industry for any amount of time, you could probably pick out 20 things that your recruiter or sales rep could do differently or more effectively on a call. So what's the natural tendency for the manager? Do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, do that. And then you're thinking, all right, yeah, great, I gave them all this great advice, and then a week later, nothing's changed. And you don't know it as the manager, but the salesperson or the recruiter's thinking, shit, man, I am so confused. Dan just gave me 20 things to think about. So yes, so from a training standpoint, ask your people to only focus on 1 or 2 skills max at a time. And yeah, from a process standpoint, absolutely. Otherwise, it'll just overwhelm your people. And that, as leaders, you got to have a finger on the pulse with your organization and their level of tolerance for change. So thank you for bringing that up. So measuring new hire training and onboarding effectiveness. And again, that slide could easily say measuring adoption of your change initiative. So from a training perspective, there's a lot of different things that you could do to track and measure the effectiveness of a training program beyond what you see on the slide. But any training program worth its salt should be tracking these 4 things at a minimum. So the first thing that says knowledge transfer, that's really ties back to how effective and engaging your training content is. So for example, there's a gazillion studies out there that say that, just reading a static Word document or a PowerPoint or a PDF, not very engaging. So the likelihood of someone remembering what they just read, not great. Retaining it long term, even worse. So the more engaging your content is, such as video or interactive playbooks and exercises, the greater the likelihood that knowledge will transfer over to your employee. So that's sort of step 1. And the way that you track that, you can track that within any LMS, and again, from training perspective, any learning management system, you can track how much content they're consuming, what they're watching, what they're reading, and then you should also be creating quizzes. So if you're making changes to your ATS and you wanted to adopt these new processes in your ATS, you should be building out quiz questions and force them to prove to you that they understand these changes and that they can execute them. Next one is application of skills. Again, instead of applications of skills, it could be application of software. What's the point of spending $1 million on a new ATS if nobody's going to use it, right? Or what's the point of making an investment in training if no one's going to actually apply the skills? So, can you physically see and hear your learners apply what's being taught? And the way that you do that, I talked about the videos and the on-demand training and coaching a minute ago, but managers need to get out of their office or out from behind their desk and their computer and literally actually sit with their people while they're making calls, while they're calling on their candidates, while they're calling on their customers or their prospects, going out on meetings, reviewing the emails and the LinkedIn invites that they're sending out. You got to get into the details. And that's how you physically see and hear whether or not they're actually applying what's been taught or what you want them to do. Again, most managers struggle to find the time for this stuff. But, well, I'm going to get to the point of all this towards the end here. So I almost let the cat out of the bag. And then adoption of behaviors and results. So how many of you currently have a mechanism for tracking the effectiveness of your training program? So when you hire new salespeople or new recruiters, do you have a way to track how effective it is and what sort of impact it's having on your organization? So, wow, okay. So we definitely need to have a way to track and measure the effectiveness of it. And there's a lot of different things that you can track and measure. A lot of it goes back to the specific staffing vertical that you're in, what your sales process is. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So obviously we want to track the results. The problem with only tracking the results, though, is we can't manage to the result. And what I mean by that is we can't, if my manager is going to say, Dan, you need to get 10 meetings a week, and that's all they measure, that's fine, but you can't manage to the result. You've got to manage to the things that are going to influence the likeliness of achieving that result. So how many outbound calls am I making? Who am I calling on? What am I actually saying? What's in my message? So you got to break it down and get into the details on that. And so we want to, so again, from a training perspective, I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, a company out of Atlanta reached out to me and they said, Dan, we want you to come and do a workshop for us. I said, fantastic. What's the workshop on? They said, we want to teach our people how to do consultative selling. I said, okay, great. So what the hell does consultative selling mean? I mean, if I asked everybody here one-on-one, we could get 100 different answers, right? So long story short, we kind of hashed out the definition of consultative selling, and we broke it down to what skills you need to have and what are the behaviors that you would exemplify. So we went and we did the workshop. The workshop was great. The people loved the content. I call the customer back about 30 days later and I say, hey, how's it going? And how's the training going? How are the people adopting it and so forth? And she says, hey, it's great, but I'm not seeing any results. We're not seeing much change. And I said, well, what are you tracking and measuring? And she said, well, we track meetings and we track job orders and interviews and placements. And I said, well, Gene, that's great. Keep measuring that stuff. But think back to the specific behaviors that we'd use, that we defined, that make up consultative selling. We've got to come up with a way. We need a mechanism to track, figure out how you're going to track that and drive those behaviors. So we had to go back and work on putting some specific metrics in place. So in this case, one of the things that we did is just creating call plans. So we taught these people that if you want to engage in consultative selling and get more meetings, step one is you just got to create a call plan and actually prepare for what you're going to say. And then within the call plan, there's a number of sort of components in there. So that was sort of one thing that we did. Then there's other behaviors like the skill of disarming, and we figured out a way to actually track that and then measure that within training with capturing through video. But again, so you've got to have the metrics in alignment with the change initiative. So that's a little bit about tracking and measuring adoption. And so all this comes down to retention. So the other thing I've noticed about staffing companies is most staffing companies have what I like to call the superhero model. Anybody want to take a guess what I might mean by the superhero business model?
The idea person in your organization sets the bar, sets the standard, and they're the superstar and everyone is concerned about that.
Yep, exactly. And I'll take it kind of one step further. How many of you, show of hands, are getting 80% of your revenue from one or two key performers, or maybe just 20% of your people? So 80% of your revenue coming from your top 20%. All right, so I see several hands going up. So that's one of the common things that we see staffing company to staffing company. I bring that up right now because all this up here ties into retention. If your employees aren't retaining what you're sharing with them and what you're teaching them, then you're never going to move the bell curve. So every sales organization and every recruiting organization falls into a bell curve. So you're going to have, you got your classic curve. You got 80% of your reps in the middle, and 80% of your reps are probably hitting like 60% of quota. You got a couple of key performers over to the far right that are knocking the ball out of the park, doing anywhere from 80 to 120% plus of quota. And then, of course, you got another 20% of your reps that are just struggling, they're probably not going to make it. So what we need to be thinking about is, how do we take the 80%, the bell curve, and move that more to the right so a higher percentage of our overall sales force is meeting and exceeding quota? And the answer to that, part of the answer to that, comes back to retention. And so what I mean by that? So I don't know if anybody's familiar with the term the forgetting curve. So there's actually a psychologist who did a massive study on memory loss. Part of the study focused on memory loss when there was no attempt to retain information. And so what it found was, basically what this slide is saying is 20 minutes from now, or 20 minutes after you leave this room, you will have already forgotten 40% of what I've shared with you. A month from now, if I call each one of you up, you will have forgotten 70% of what I've shared with you, if there's no attempt to retain what's shared. So you literally got information going in one ear and out the other, or information in one ear and money out your back door, if there's no plan to sustain the change. So pretty interesting stuff. So the other key component, and I could do a whole session on coaching, but I want to hit on a couple of key points here. The other key component, sustain activity, is coaching. And so I guess I'm just trying to think where I want to start. So the number one way that you're going to influence your employees, so what's ultimately going to drive change, is not the training that you put them through, or not asking them to watch a video on how to enter a candidate into your ATS. It's going to be tied directly back to the quality of the questions that your frontline manager asks of your employee about the training or whatever it is you're asking them to do, and how often they ask them those questions. So I'll give you an example. You can be the judge if it's a good example. It's the best I could come up with. So I'm a golfer, not very good, but imagine if I go and I hire a swing coach, and so I hire a swing coach, and I go and I see him a couple days, once a week for 2 months, let's say, in the spring and in the early part of the summer. I also go to the driving range, and I play a round of golf each week. So I start to figure out my swing, and I start to get better. My handicap comes down. But then imagine I get busy with work, and I'm traveling all over the country, and I can't make it to go see my swing coach. But then I want to go and play a round of golf with my buddies. And so what happens is I'm going to get rusty. And because I haven't been working with my coach, and my coach hasn't been pointing those things out for a month, I get uncomfortable with the things that he or she taught me. So I revert back to my bad habits, and all of a sudden, boom, my drive is slicing, my putting sucks, and I'll just leave it right there. But I think you probably get the idea. So the questions that your managers are asking your people is the key to driving change. Now, here's another thing that I've learned working with 400 different staffing firms. A lot of managers, many managers, think coaching is telling. So let me be really clear. Telling your people what to do or how to do it is not going to make change. It's very unstructured. It's haphazard. In fact, telling is so much different from coaching. Telling focuses on the past. It's usually scrutiny oriented. Whereas coaching is something that should be done, it should be planned for in advance. It should be collaborative. And the best practice for coaching is the leader is leading by asking questions. And you're leading by asking questions so that you can empower the person to come up with the solution to their own problem, right? Rather than saying, hey, do this, do that, do it this way or that way. You've got to lead them. You've got to get your people, let me rephrase that. You've got to lead your people with questions so that they come to understand what the issue is that's holding them back on their own. If they don't come to terms or don't come to their own self-realization on what's holding them back, they're never going to buy in and commit to any solution or suggestion you're making them. It's no different than selling to a customer. If you can't get the customer to buy in and believe that there's a problem to be solved, they're never going to buy into any solution that you're pitching or a candidate that you're pitching. It's the same thing. So the other piece with coaching is, so the rep or the recruiter also has to believe that there's a need for a new skill and a need for a new piece of knowledge in order to have an improvement in their performance or to improve their effectiveness. So you can't coach by just sitting behind your desk either. As I mentioned earlier, you got to get out from underneath your desk. You got to get out on calls. You got to sit with them while they make sales calls or candidate calls and actually hear what they're saying. What I like to do with like the way that we do coaching. In fact, I had an early East Coast call this morning with some managers, and the way that we do it is, so they'll like video record themselves having like a conversation. And rather than us telling them, hey, you should have done this or done that, we actually just have them self-diagnose themselves. And it's amazing. The best part about it, it makes your job as a manager so much easier. Think about it. How many times have you gone into a one-on-one and you're thinking, oh man, I got to tell Dan that his activity sucks and he's got to improve what he's doing, and you get that lump in the back of your throat. No, there's going to be conflict. Not with this approach. You ask them, lead with questions, they'll self-diagnose. Your people are smart. They'll figure it out. All right. So, last piece on coaching. Oh, yeah. So one thought comes to mind, and that is trust. So I think how we ask the question is just as important, if not more important, than the question that we're asking. So one of the things that we teach when like training managers and sales reps and recruiters when they're on the phone with a candidate or a customer is the skill of disarming. You've got to be really good at disarming people. Making yourself vulnerable is a really important thing as you probably know, with your people, so that they feel comfortable in return and being truly honest. Otherwise, yeah, you could get answers that are sugar-coated. Now, I don't know if that's the case with that person. Sometimes there's people that just aren't coachable, and that could be the case too. So a couple of thoughts here on just how to structure coaching. And again, I could go on and on about this, but I want to talk about how you use data to have a coaching conversation. So what I suggest you think about, if you're not doing this already, is the first of the month, pull together a report. I'm assuming you're pulling together a report out of your ATS or whatever that shows your rep or your recruiter, all their activity, and then their performance as far as placements and gross profit and all that stuff. And rather than going and sitting down with them and saying, Dan, you need to make more calls, and Dan, you need to get more meetings to get more placements, instead, give the report to your employees, their own personal report. Hey, take a day. I want you to review it, look it over. You and I are going to get together tomorrow. We're going to have a one-on-one. When you get together on the one-on-one, you're going to say, hey, so tell me, what are some of the trends that you picked up from looking at your performance and activity over the last month? Why do you suppose that happened? What changed? What thoughts did it kind of conjure up in your mind? How did it make you feel as you looked at this report? So you want to start asking them questions, and they're going to just say out loud what they need to do going forward. There's no need to scrutinize them. In most instances, if employees are being open and honest with themselves. And then, depending on how big your organization is, so then the director of sales the following day would have the same conversation with his or her managers, same discussion and talking with the managers about the conversations they had with their sales reps or recruiters. So we talked earlier about how it needs to be driven from top down. So you can't roll out change. Well, let me rephrase that. You can't expect lasting change to stick if it's not driven from the top. So the top person needs to ask, the president needs to ask, the executive VPs, down to the VPs, to the directors and so forth, whatever your org structure is. So really, really important. And that's how we make sure that we have alignment top down and that all the right questions are being asked and the right metrics are being tracked to ensure that the change is going to stick long term. So the question now becomes why? You're probably thinking, Jesus Christ, Dan, it's a lot of freaking work. It is. I'm working up a sweat. So why? Why do we want to take the time to do that? What's the payoff? Well, your job as a leader is you should be thinking about and trying to build an organization that achieves predictable and scalable revenue growth. So I mentioned earlier the superhero model. If you want to achieve breakthrough revenue growth, you can't do it by relying on one or two top performers. And oh, by the way, you can't rely on hiring experienced people. I talk to a lot of staffing companies and they tell me, yeah, we don't hire young kids anymore. It just doesn't work out. It's turnover. We're going to hire experienced people, superstars. Yeah, good luck with that. That's not a scalable solution. There's not enough people out there. There's always going to be another company down the road that's going to offer more money. At some point, if you want to take your company to the next level, you've got to build the muscle internally and the mechanisms to be able to not only hire people, but to do the things that I've been talking about as far as sustaining change so that you can achieve predictable and scalable revenue. So what does that mean? What exactly does that mean, predictable, scalable revenue? Well, I could talk about any one of the icons that we see up here. I'm going to talk about Duke basketball for a second. I totally agree. I am not a fan. I'm a college basketball fan, but not a fan of Duke. But I will say this. So for those of you that aren't a college basketball fan, so Duke competes for the ACC conference championship year in and year out. They're usually ranked top 5 year in and year out. Usually get a number 1, number 2, number 3 seed in the NCAA tournament, and they're usually one of the favorites to win the NCAA tournament. Now, granted, Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski, who's the head coach, and he's been there for years, and he's built the whole program. He definitely gets the best of the talent. But here's what's amazing about what he's done. He gets the best talent, or a lot of the best talent, not all the talent, but much of the best talent. But the kids he recruits, they're one and done. They go to the NBA after 1 year, maybe 2 years. Think about that. I bet you guys have a lot of turnover like that, right? How is it that somebody who has all that turnover still maintains and sustains the level of performance for, I don't know, he's been there for 20, 30 years, however long he's been there? It's because he's got a system and he's got a process. And it's not overly dependent on just one superstar. And so having a business that can achieve predictable and scalable revenue is really about the de-emphasis of the individual. And it's really about the emphasis on your internal systems and processes and how you're going about managing it. And obviously everything that I've talked about today with driving and sustaining change. And so that's what I think everybody in here as leaders, one of the things you should be thinking about and striving for is how can I build my business to get to a point where I actually have predictable and scalable revenue growth. I'm not sure where we're at on time, but that's all I came prepared to share. So I'm going to open it up to any questions that we have. I think coachability. Just from my personal experience, and also, so personal experience hiring people, managing them, training them, and also experience working with a lot of customers over the years. I think coachability by far and away. Because you can hire people that are good or have the aptitude, but they could also have a bad attitude and just be a nightmare to manage and create all kinds of other issues. From a training perspective?
Well, not necessarily. I'm just anything that you've experienced.
Oh.
Yeah. Training is what you do. So.
Yeah. So train your managers. So I would say that. No, I don't see anybody investing. I mean, I was actually talking to a friend. I don't know if anybody here knows Tom Kosnick. Great guy, great. He's also a consultant in the industry. We were having a conversation yesterday how we both were talking. We said most of our customers don't set aside money to invest in training their frontline managers. So I think they're by far the key to growing your business. And that's where I think you would want to invest. And that's where we see by far and away the quickest and easiest way to move the needle. So assuming you have the right people in the management role. Oh, never seen that one before. Yeah. So the way that I've handled that in the past is I'll pull that person aside and I basically try to have a heart-to-heart with them and give them a little not a sales pitch because I'm sincere when I do it, but I remind them that people in the office look up to that person because they're a top performer. And whether they like it or not, people are going to just look at them and they're going to follow their behavior. And so you got to really work to build a relationship with that person. Now, so that's one thing. But now the question then becomes, well, will that person do that or are they just a jerk? And so if they're a jerk, then you got to move on. Yeah. Because I've worked with so many customers over the years that have been, I kind of say, like, you're kind of like held hostage by your top performer. Nobody in the office likes them. Everybody's talking about that person behind their back. And you know it, Mr. Owner or Miss Owner. So what are you going to do? Your business is not going to be able to grow until you make that change. I mean, you're just going to go as far as that person. You'll never go farther. Somebody had a question over here. Yep. Yeah, so there is a lot of studies out there. I don't know what the exact statistic is. That e-learning and using video, there's a saying that video's worth, a picture's worth 1,000 words, video's worth like 1 billion words. And there's, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but so sort of best in class training is it's blended. So you have a combination of video training where they watch videos, then they get quizzed on that. Then you ask them to execute the skills and behaviors that they're taught. Then you reinforce it through coaching and then also do live workshops. So it's instructor-led training and online training. Yep. Yeah. So, So I think if you can put in, it depends on what you're rolling out and what the change is. So incentives are great. Show them the promised land, reward them. My only word of caution, though, with that is, again, depending on what you're rolling out, there could be a risk of like they do it to get the incentive, and then once the incentive goes away, then they revert back to the old way. So, you can't do the incentive in lieu of what I was talking about. And I think, I'm sure you know that. But I think, incentives are a good way to, get people excited and get them moving in the right direction. Yeah. So it's a great question. So I would start with talking to your top performers. So you must have a top performer in your office or whatever job function you're talking about who you think is the most competent or does whatever the process is most effectively. Go sit with them. Spend an hour or however long it takes. Watch them do their job. Take detailed notes. Ask them questions. Why are you doing this? Why do you do it this way? Why don't you do it put on your business analyst hat and get into the details. So that would be the best place to start because it's free. You don't need to hire a consultant. The other thing, as you are interviewing people and you're in the back of your mind thinking about how we want to adopt best practices for whatever process it is, ask them what they think the best practice is. So those would be two great places to start. From there, then of course you could go to a consultant. Any consultant, if you called me up out of the blue and said, hey, we're trying to figure out our sales process, any consultant would share with you what best practice is over the phone. You can go implement. It's up to you at that point to go implement it. But and coming to conferences like this and networking with people. So I think that's I think those would be the good ways to go about figuring that out. Did I see somebody else's hand go up over here? Maybe not. Any other questions? Cool. Well, I hope you guys found this helpful. Enjoy the rest of the conference and your stay in Vegas. Thank you.